I don't know how much you all know each other, so I'll do a very brief introduction. Baird is our special guest today. He's never been on these webcasts with us before. He's a world-renowned environmental philosopher who has written innumerable books. One of his specialties is the analysis of Aldo Leopold's work. And one of the things I noted that I thought was very interesting, oh, is that Catherine? Or is that?
Hi, hi Aviva, it's Catherine.
Great, I'm so glad you could join us. One of the things I noted when I was going through your biography, Baird, was that your dissertation had been on Plato's theory of forms.
Yes, that's right. Plato was my first love in philosophy, and I've been teaching, that is to say, before I retired, a course in ancient philosophy practically every year for 49 years. And so, and I returned to the Greeks in my most recent book, which is called Greek Natural Philosophy, the Pre-Socratics and Their Importance for Environmental Philosophy. So I kind of made a full circle there.
Do you realize that you're sort of seesawing visually?
Yeah, that's because I'm holding my computer on my lap, and I'll move and put it on a table. That'll be a lot better.
Good idea, because it makes me a little seasick.
Yeah.
So Jean is at, oh, I just drew a complete blank. Baton Rouge, Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. And one of his many claims to fame, he's also quite famous, is that he was the primary monitoring person on the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico. He's a wetlands biologist. Jim is also extremely illustrious. Everybody here is very illustrious.
A lot of ideas, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And he is the dean at the University of Colorado at Boulder.
Oh.
And let's see, you're a paleoecologist is the last I heard. Is that correct?
I'm a paleoclimatologist.
Oh, right. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
And
I wouldn't dream of stepping into Jean's area. That would be a bad idea.
Oh, come on, come on.
See?
One of Jim's really fascinating areas of expertise is he was one of the first people to point out the implications of mitigating climate change with vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
And
excellent.
He and I go back to 2007 when we first started to work together for a show called Weather Report at the Boulder Museum of Art. And then Jean joined us a couple years later, and it was out of our relationship between the three of us that we created Fish Story, which was about Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to just turn off my constant contact so you don't hear that ghastly clicking. Catherine is at the University of Minnesota, and I met Catherine. And Catherine, are you technically a sociologist?
Legal anthropologist.
Okay. Hold on, sorry. Oh, I think this is my cat's vet. Hold on one second.
So,
I'm going to introduce myself real quick.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Do.
This is Daisy. I'll just. Oh, okay. Here comes Aviva. Aviva, I muted you, so when you're ready to come back, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm here, and I apologize. My cat had a recent diagnosis of chronic pancreatitis, so I've been waiting for a call back from the vet. Anyway, Catherine and I met last fall when I was visiting the University of Minnesota, and she became interested in the project that I've been working on to arrest fossil fuels, the Blue Tree Symphony, and we're now trying to work together to create an installation in Minnesota that would help save Lake Superior.
And she was just about to introduce herself, I think, Aviva.
I'm sorry, Catherine, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Could you please go on?
No, just really quick. I just, looked up your Gulf to Gulf project and was starting to kind of look at how you've been working. And I too, I'm working in the legal field, but I am very interested in bringing art into this field because, and I've been doing this with a new ownership structure, a new ownership model for solar energy, low-income community solar that uses trust law, which hasn't been used before, so that communities can be owners of benefits of solar assets. So these things require this kind of innovation in property, using trust property to get around the utility and other obstacles that have been thrown up in the 20th century to energy transition. And so we're finding that trust law is allowing us to have a different, kind of property structure, just as it has done, in previous areas. And but if communities don't know they are owners or have rights, then what does that mean? You can only really do that with public art as an ally, co-creating that the way as an anthropology it used to be, that law and these other things, including scientific knowledge and empirical observation, was very much tied to ritual, art, and various other things before the modern era. So that's how I come in here, starting to work with Aviva on other things, and why I'm so fascinated in your own work.
Could you expand a little bit on what trust law is?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, so trust law is the oldest form of property, I would say, in the common law tradition, English common law. It arose when in the feudal era, when that property regime only allowed the king to be the owner of the land. And so that wiped away the customary laws of villages and local kind of rules for sharing. And in particular, even energy and food resources. So trust law arose as this very clever way to get around the inequities of that. And I can talk a little bit more, but some of those early rituals of trusting somebody else to be an owner, and they could be a legal owner, but the benefits were owned as an equitable ownership model. And so you split ownership and got around the property regime of the time. Now, today we have a kind of property is just public or private property regimes. And so again, using trust law to kind of very cleverly work around the obstacles that are now entrenched in that property regime, and finding to be very useful for social equity, and especially around the energy transition, which is going to be, there will be benefits, monetary benefits, economic benefits there that can be captured by the same investors who have owned the current energy system. But using this other form of trust property, we feel like we could have some kind of, this is called, the project is called the Solar Commons. And it's using this trust property, which was the ownership model for commons in the feudal era, and it's using those to access those benefits for low-income communities today.
Okay.
Thank you. That was really, really helpful and really, really thorough. This morning, I was working on a syllabus for a workshop I'm going to be teaching in a couple of weeks. And one of the things I addressed was that my approach to art is about going from the theoretical, which is really grounded in physics, to the very practical. And one of the reasons I wanted to get this group together is because Baird and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about what has happened in Memphis since Jean and Jim and I did Fish Story. And what we did with Fish Story Memphis was we analyzed the geographic relationships between the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi Water Basin to try to identify what I call a trigger point, a point in the entire landscape whose restoration could have a large landscape impact. And we ultimately began working on the connection between the Wolf River and the Mississippi and did a project there in 2013. When Baird and I spoke, and I invited him to be part of this conversation, he sent me a brief article about the new report that Memphis has submitted, or yeah, it's in the process of submission, for how they want to redesign the point that Jean and I especially had identified, well, all three of us really had identified as critical to environmental restoration and specifically flooding issues in Memphis. And I sent everybody around my response to the paper this morning, which was something like, this is really cosmetic, but it doesn't address any of the underlying issues, and it's an awful waste of money just to make people feel good about something that is a fairy tale. One of the things I wanted to talk about is how we get from there to here. How do we get from the good theory of the kinds of issues that Baird and the rest of us are trying to work on to an actual strategic solution, and then get derailed? And this is relevant to the work that Catherine and I want to do in Minnesota, because again, we're trying to go from a theoretical approach to how the legal system may or may not reinforce common good, versus when that gets interrupted by corporate interpretations, for example, of eminent domain. Eminent domain, just very briefly, for those of you who are listening or don't know, is the process of taking private property ostensibly for the public good, specifically economic public good. But in recent years, some conservative judges, in fact, have objected to how that has been applied, because in fact, corporations have used the notion of public good as leverage to simply take land for private profit. And that is the situation in Duluth alongside Lake Superior that we're trying to address. So I'd like to start by asking you each to comment on your own experience of trying to go from the theoretical to the practical solutions. And I'd like to start with Jean, because I know that you have torn your hair out over monitoring the Gulf of Mexico. Jean, are you muted?
He's muted.
You're muted.
Yes, I'm muted now. Are you asking for a generic or a specific example?
I'm asking why, I suppose it's obvious that a lot of this is political, but beyond that, can you analyze any of the dynamics on how we get so derailed going from wonderful sound theory to real practical solutions in the environment?
I guess coming from a, an untrained neophyte to, I've had more experience now. It started out with thinking, well, if I get the technical aspects correct of interrelationships, that the rest will fall into place and policy will follow. And what the ground, of course, has moved underneath for the last several decades, so that the reliability of science is not accepted as well, or it's been distracted by other low-hanging fruits or cherries or whatever. So it still needs to have clarity. So it's not that it's a waste of time to do the technical stuff, because you have to know what you need to do. You need some ground to move forward on it. But then the path is not linear after that. And in a way, I guess the integration with public policy, which a couple key people have focused on, the role of having company, having the public citizen in science, in engaging with journalists and doing other things like that. They can't be done by one person all the time. I mean, we're just not all, most of us are not equipped to deal with more than one or two personalities, and there's multiple involved. So it's been a confounding but evolving path over the years. And I'm at the end of my technical career, you might say, trying to do things well I can. And the I'm still working on the clarity part, but I'm getting antsy about having something happen, because the dead zone offshore, it hasn't happened. The low cost, the restoration on our coast is tied to that for reasons I won't have to get into, but that is stuck in this policy from the state that is very narrow-minded and cluttered by a science, in part cluttered by scientists who have distracted from the actual causing consequences because there's a political task involved. And so you go on. And in short, I'll just say that I've found other allies, other fields of expertise that have been helpful for myself so that I learn what not to do. I don't necessarily know what to do, but a couple of them have been lawyers. They've been great. And others have been involved with a history group now, and they're the experts, but I'm learning, from them. So it's been, unfortunately, we're going to run out of gas sooner or later, but it's been worthwhile, because it seems like it's a maturing view of the world and what needs to be done. And I appreciate, even though it's painful.
Jim, I don't know how much you've gotten into law with some of the ways that you address your students or your audiences when you talk about climate change. Does it come up?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, certainly the legal aspects of environmental issues are one of the key players in that discussion. When we started the environmental studies program back in, gosh, way too many years ago, it was with the recognition that it wasn't just a science question, many of these issues we were dealing with, but it was really a question that included law and sociology and economics and religion and philosophy, and all of those pieces were pieces that you had to consider, because it was pretty clear that really obvious scientific rationale was not winning. We talk about climate change a lot, but when I go through this in class, I like to start students out with something that's a little bit more straightforward, like lead and gasoline, which early doctors back in the early 1900s said this was a remarkably bad idea, that what you were doing was taking a toxic element and you were spreading it around in inner city areas very effectively, poisoning an entire generation of children. And that was, there's a lot of writing about that. So it was very clear that this was a dumb idea, but it also happened, and it took us, 40 years, 50 years to get lead out of gasoline. So that's good, because that helps students, not good, but it helps students understand that clear scientific thinking and rationale is not necessarily going to win the day, that you've got to consider all the other pieces that are involved here, the other actors on the stage, and their biases and their desires, and what are all the other pieces that are in there. Sadly, there's way too many examples, Aviva, of really solid, good things we should be doing that we eventually did, but we took 40, 50 years to actually do it, because we don't have a straight path from the obvious to action.
This past weekend, I was interviewed as part of a group of 3 artists who are ecofeminists for a show that just opened. And one of the issues that came up was that the piece that I have in this show is the earliest in the show. It's from 1973. And what I said about it was, at the time, in 1973, I was so effing naive. I thought if I just showed people clearly how important this was, the logic of it, and provided good art to make the point, they would get it and it would change. And I was really astonished for decades that that was irrelevant. That
Yeah.
clear thinking, good evidence, powerful material really doesn't cut it. So I'd like to go to Baird, and I wonder, Baird, if you have some comments really grounded in your studies of the Greek philosophers. How did the Greek philosophers respond to this problem in human nature of being blind to logic?
Well, that was the one of the classic differences between the Socratic and Platonic tradition and the Aristotelian tradition. Socrates and Plato sort of thought, well, if you present a rational argument, then there is, and you know the good, so to speak, there's no way that you wouldn't choose the good. Aristotle used the term akrasia, which means that basically there's always a sort of gap between knowing what's good and making the right choice in doing it. So it's a classic problem, and it remains. I mean, you know, philosophy, you never get a conclusive answer. So it's still debated to this day. But let me speak a little bit to my own experience. When we began to invent environmental philosophy in the mid-1970s, as part of an environmental studies group, I was at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and Stevens Point as the campus specialty at the master's level was natural resources. And those guys were all what is known as hook and bullet faculty. It was wildlife management for game. It was forestry for cutting down trees, and so forth and so on. I came in talking a new language, environmental ethics, and we started introducing new terminology, like the difference between something that is of intrinsic value and something that's of only instrumental value, and anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism. And they laughed in my face. It was like, this guy is crazy. But I think over time there's been a delayed reaction. One of the hats that I wear is as an associate editor for the journal Conservation Biology. And I see this language now that was radical and completely ridiculous in the 1970s being very much a part of the conversation among conservation biologists. And so what I see is no direct link between theory and something happening. It's much more indirect link. I like to think of us environmental philosophers as having loosed some new ideas into a larger sort of conversation. And once they're out there running around in the world, you never know exactly, you know, what the outcome is going to be, but over time you do see change. So that I think most natural resources or resource management departments are hook and bullet is something that's very much in the past. I was speaking of the Great Lakes. I was on a research group that was rethinking fisheries management in the Great Lakes, sponsored by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And there again, those guys who had this history of invasions from the Atlantic alewife and sea lamprey and so on, their original solution was to release hatchery-raised Pacific salmon into the Great Lakes to create a support fishery, but they were seeing that was kind of, it wasn't from their view a sustainable solution, and they were looking for ecological restoration on a large scale. Now that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had in the intervening years between the 1970s and the 1990s, which was when I was working with them, these intellectual movements, which eventually sort of found their way in unexpected ways into the thinking of people who had never read a word of environmental philosophy or ethics, but the ideas were out there and they were starting to take some effect. So that's really been my experience. I do see change, and especially in applied ecology and conservation biology and places like that.
I'd like to go to Catherine. I'd like to ask you about the question of time, because as most of you know, for many years I've worked on a theoretical premise that you can identify a small point in large systems that can affect change as a trigger point. And for my own dissertation, I identified 6 rules by which you could identify that point. And one of the rules that I've been puzzling over for months now since the pandemic is that there's a paradox in time between when we recognize that a situation is urgent and that somehow there seems to be time to solve things, and yet there can be phenomenal collateral damage in the meantime. And how do you deal with that? So Catherine, I wonder if you could deal with or address your own experience of the urgency of what's happening around Lake Superior and the process you feel that you're going through of incrementally making the kind of important progress that Baird was describing.
Well, so one thing I'm doing with other people here in Lake Superior, we've gotten together with people in several universities around the Great Lakes. So University of Minnesota in Duluth, Lakehead and Thunder Bay, and Algoma and Sault Ste. Marie. And we've created something called a Living Labs Network, Lake Superior Living Labs Network. So we're taking the watershed of Lake Superior as the, as our bioregion, as our jurisdiction, not the Canadian-US border, but we're taking the bioregion as the border. We got a big grant from the Canadian government and for this 3-year project. So what we're doing is we're taking this idea of living labs. So we're getting out of our universities. Even the idea of living labs used to be that you tried to do these environmental things on your campus and use your campus site as the place where you would teach and use the campus cosmology, the kind of cosmological and jurisdictional opportunities that a campus gives. I think that was a really interesting thing about 30 years ago to start doing. But the bureaucracies of our campuses are also overwhelmingly delay tactics for the work we need to do. So this is Living Labs, taking it out of that, putting them into community. This is place-based community work. The idea is that we can, communities that are doing the work already, if universities can have alliances with them in these kind of living labs models, that we can actually speed up the work that we're doing. Now, you know, so, and share, you know, we can create models for teaching and research that are iterative around the Great Lakes for these problems. So our focus has been social ecological issues. So we do food, energy, water, well-being, and we have a very specific alliance with the indigenous peoples around the Great Lakes and those entities. So we're very conscientious of the paradigm about the natural world, which they bring to our work. So we're not, we get around some of the things that I think Baird was talking about with the Enlightenment paradigm that, you know, kind of separates work, or even the Aristotelian one. So in our work, we're trying to find a way to talk about the animate value of the natural world. And we can find correlations to that, you know, in law, in our research, in other ways. How do we talk about that? Anyway, but we're building living labs that are community-based and bring benefits to communities. And that's a bottom line. So you can't just study or send students out to these communities to work on these projects. You know, if there's not a benefit there to the community, that would be unethical. So we have, you know, we have some ethical bottom lines too. So that's one way that I'm trying to work around some of the things you've all described here, both our, you know, philosophical frameworks that we work in as researchers, but also our bureaucratic, our institutional temporalities that slow us down. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, the Blue Trees Project would be one of the projects in our Living Labs network. We would use that as a site that brings together art, law, and, you know, property issues, and it's a trigger point, you know, in what's the Line 3 pipeline that's going to, you know, open up for at least 10 years, a huge amount of oil that's going to come through from the Bakken fields and Canada, and start using Lake Superior as, you know, the last of these great clean water lakes as a transportation route for this dirty oil that's coming through. So that's Line 3 has been, you know, a lot of the indigenous peoples here have, Winona LaDuke and others have moved the Standing Rock, you know, trigger point moment to Duluth, where I am right now, and to made Line 3 the stand right now for moving forward. So I guess that's how I would kind of enter what we're talking about.
A quick question that I have, are the indigenous people mostly Anishinaabe?
Yes. Yes.
It strikes me that what the task is to be Zen in the face of hysteria. That's kind of Jean's expertise, to be Zen even though the sky is falling and the earth is dissolving. But I want to open it up to anybody who wants to ask each other questions about how we get from the theory to the practice when we really are in a point of extremis on the planet. I don't know, is there anybody who would disagree that the planet is in extremis?
I would disagree with that. It's been around for 3.5 billion years, and it's undergone many catastrophic events. I think that it's the current sort of state of the planet on which we and what Aldo Leopold called our fellow travelers in the Odyssey of evolution are all adapted to. So the planet itself is not having a fever or dying or anything like that. It's rather that the conditions on the planet are changing in such a way that they're no longer going to be favorable to the current complement of species, including Homo sapiens. So I think that's a more accurate way of putting it. But that is, I'm not saying it's not a crisis, but it's a crisis that is of for us really. I like to think of it as that the planet is having a kind of is having a kind of immune reaction to an invasive species that's a little bit out of control. And just as our immune system goes into a fever, where the climate change is really most of all a threat to us.
So the pandemic is just one symptom of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. And I think those people who study these things think that this is just, this is just the beginning of pandemics.
Sadly.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Could I ask a question of the scientists here? Is that all right?
Of course.
Yeah. So, with the pandemic, we've had this slowdown in economic activity that has cleaned the air, water, and other things. And, that tactic has been, one talked about by political economists and ecologists, the whole idea of a slowing down or I don't know, for Aviva, culture jamming or techniques that we have to slow down. So if we can't really intervene and, have the time for the urgency that we're in, then a kind of, ancillary and necessary tactic has to be slowing down. What do you think about that? I mean, along with restoration and other things, if the work of slowing down what these huge, infrastructure projects that are ruining us are doing, if we can't slow them down, so what do you think about that?
Jim, you're a resident optimist. This is your cue.
I was going to turn to Jean.
But Jean, unmute yourself.
I completely forgot what I was about to say. Jean, rescue me, and I'll fill in after you.
Okay. I've shown a slide sometimes talking this point, which is that we have limits as a species or system of interacting species, and we're running out of space. I mean, the pandemic, this particular one likes really dense populations, and it's got it. So it spreads a lot easier, and there'll be others sometimes coincidentally with them. So we're reaching different kinds of limits, and one of them is going to be heat, loss of ice caps, and it depends how we react to that. So Gene Odom was a fairly well-known ecologist, now deceased, and his brother Howard Odom wrote a book. Couldn't write. He could have written better, but he wrote a book, and it was very interesting. And his wife finished it with him just before he died, and it was called A Prosperous Way Down. And the graph I show with that is, you can have a staircase going down, or you can have a shaft that you fall down. And so you can bump yourself going down, or you can collapse by being, squashed at the bottom of your own weight. And that's kind of where we are, I think, is to make that transition. And I'm not sure we're capable of it, frankly. But yeah, I'm not going to stop me from trying to be capable of it. And if you look at the pandemic, the response is, well, we'll beat nature again, the virus has other understandings of its capability, so we're going through maybe the end of the first wave and going into the second wave now, depending where you are. And it has other ideas, and we're going to have to adapt to it, not it to us, at least for the next year or two. So I guess that's kind
Go
of,
ahead, Gene.
Catherine.
Jim, did you remember what you wanted to say?
Now he's going to be an optimist.
No, I remember what I was going to say, but I don't know if I'm an optimist or not. Actually, this is probably one of the more pessimistic comments I'm about to make.
I must be contagious.
So we are part of the planet, and when we put something into the atmosphere or into the water or wherever, those compounds we put there cycle around. And the planet is pretty good about moving things around. Sometimes we use the term cleaning up, but that is a little bit of a misnomer. So for example, any water-soluble pollutants that we have been putting in the atmosphere as we have slowed down because of COVID-19, they have been cleaned up much faster. So there's a bunch of atmospheric pollutants that are all scrubbed by water, which has a residence time of only a few days in the atmosphere, that have definitely gone down. And so you might say, yes, the atmosphere is cleaner. But I think we have to be very careful that we think about this the next step, because where did all that stuff go after it got washed out by the rain? It went into aquatic ecosystems. It went into other longer lived ecosystems. And that is where sometimes this whole thing about time becomes a real challenge for human beings. We are so very focused on the immediate that we take, great joy that the atmosphere is cleaner, but we forget the fact that the marine sediments and lake sediments and vegetation are still polluted, remain polluted, and will remain polluted for a long period of time. And that, to me, one of the most fascinating things about our relationship with the planet is our inability to really grasp the importance of time, and that the time scale on which the planet likes to function is not anywhere near the time scale in which we like to function. And that creates some really serious mismatches and some serious problems. So that was pretty pessimistic.
Well, I hate to say it, but I think that's a kind of progress for you, Jim.
So I'll defend the dean. Sometimes you ask, not as generic ask, whether he's optimist or realist, and I think it's just a matter of being practical and a realist. It's not whether you're one or the other. These are the facts, ma'am, kind of approach to it. So what has happened? You're welcome. You deserve it. So one of what's happened is that CO2 levels have dropped a little bit with all the strife and discontent with it. And now they're starting to go back up again, the emission rates into the atmosphere. And this is hardly over. And that the amount it dropped for all that disruption was very small compared to what we need to do. Yeah. So we just got a reality check, and nobody's paying attention to it. And its scale, the effect of it, is way less than what needs to be done. So what's going to happen? It seems clear. Unless something more drastic happens, it's going to continue. People are so ready.
I will say, let me revert to my optimistic self. I think one of the things that the situations like this do illustrate just how much crap we put into the atmosphere and into the water all the time. You know, the fact that NOx levels have gone down, you know, that's because we're driving our cars less, and we're, you know, stuff like that. And it's really a pretty stark, in your face, you know, if you weren't doing this, those pollutants would be higher, kind of moment. I think, you know, the 9/11 moment, when all the airplanes were out of the sky, and the yeah, for just 3 days, and that was enough. You could actually physically see, you know, climatological, you can see pollution levels change. It was pretty remarkable that even on such a short time scale you could see that. And that just, to me, it reinforced how much junk we put in the air and into the water all the time. So
But
that ended pessimistic. I'm sorry.
there's a lot of talk about the possibility of this being a moment of real change, because people are now finding out that they don't have to drive and they don't have to go to the office, and they can only go to the grocery store once a year. By the way, I've been telling people I've lost 15 pounds because I'm not eating out for lunch. And my wife prefers vegetarian cooking, and I'm the cook, so we're both healthier, ironically, than before the virus. So I think that we're finding out that we can do without a lot of the stuff we thought we needed to do, and we're better off without it. I mean, productivity, I think, is increased as people are working from home rather than decreasing. I think where education is concerned, especially for kids, that they're falling behind in that. I mean, you know, kids are not, you know, getting paid, and so they don't have to be productive. But I think that there are going to be a lot of changes. We may find that some of these reductions will be the new normal.
You know,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I would say that, you know, I view these things as always as moments to learn. And, you know, I agree with you, Baird. You know, we've learned that sort of the rat race life we were living is really not, maybe it's not as, you know, productive and pleasant as we thought it was. On the other hand, we've also learned that in order for us to stay home and do what we're doing right now, there are people going to work who are typically lower down in the socioeconomic ladder, who are typically more Black and Hispanic than we are, who are, and so this is also, you know, cast a pretty harsh light on the stratification of society that many of us didn't even realize was going on.
You
know, as you know, we've got a bunch of academics here. You're aware of this, that, you know, there's a lot of debate about, do I want to go back into the classroom and teach in the fall? And that debate has really, at least at my university, opened a lot of doors up to people thinking about how is it that I'm even able to stay at home and do this. Anyway, sorry.
No, I was just going to mention that one of the things that came up in that interview, which was Saturday at the gallery, was a long conversation after the interview with the gallery director, trying to identify some of the significance of his opening a show right now. As most of you, I'm sure, are aware, the whole cultural center has just come to a screeching halt. And it's a political statement to open a show, because it's a physical show. It's not just virtual. There's a handful of galleries in New York, which is cheek to jowl galleries, but only a handful are opening right now. And so we talked about what is the goal of doing a show right now, and particularly about ecofeminism, which is a very political statement on its own, and it's in a commercial gallery. And what emerged from the conversation is that for the gallery director, Thomas Urban, and I'm sure for many other people who are trying to figure out how to engage, we're all trying to figure out what the new narrative is. We're living in a new universe, the whole world is. And the task of the artist is always to articulate the story, to show the new world. And Baird, I'm sure from your dissertation, you're well aware of just how that happens. And Jim, I'm very suspicious of you moving around, that you're about to bolt from us all.
You've got 9 minutes. Keep going here.
Anyway, this is the part that I find really interesting and very, very difficult. How do each of us go forward? We've been going forward on a timeline, a trajectory that had a relatively regular rhythm to it. And all of a sudden, the rhythm has become very disjunctive. It's extremely presto in one way. In another way, it's just completely erratic and random. And yet, as practitioners in our various fields, task is to go forward. I have to figure out how to teach a class. I have to figure out how to do a project. I'm trying to edit a book. We're all trying to do this stuff in this world that has become kaleidoscopically impossible.
Aviva, are you saying, because I just am finding out about your Gulf to Gulf work, but are you saying that the work that you were doing before, you as a collective, is becoming not a way to work anymore, is becoming evident that it's what was innovative, what seemed to be a trigger point, place, and etc., seems to, what worked 8 years ago, 7, 5, is for an alliance between artists and scientists is not working now. What?
No, not at all. One of the things that was really interesting when Jim and I started doing these webcasts was we started with a bunch of information, started looking at the stuff, and we did a product that went to the Venice Biennale and so on. And then we looked at it. And we looked at it, and for me, I don't know how you felt exactly at the time, Jim, it was stunning, because the issues that were obvious that we were going to face, such as hundreds of millions of people migrating from Bangladesh, was just completely overwhelming. So I think, and yet we kept on working. And I think it's no different now. I think that we keep trying to look at what are the issues right now? What do we see? Where does it go? When we did Fish Story, that was an iteration of how to look at things and how to produce something that was not that different than what we did in 2007. In 2007, we looked at Bangladesh, New Orleans, and the Nile in terms of the relationship to conflict zones and climate change. It was pretty intense. But Fish Story was pretty intense too, because the issues in Memphis are very intractable and very serious. And I can't see that they ever got solved at all. As far as I can tell, you still have a ring around the main part of the city of Memphis where there's a tremendous amount of poverty, and nothing has changed that. You still have a tremendous amount of pollution going into the Mississippi River, and nothing has changed that. As Jean said, all this comes down to the Gulf of Mexico, where it creates dead zones. Mm-hmm. That doesn't stop us from trying to look at it and think about it, because the more we look at it and think about it, the more something emerges that might have some hope. Mm-hmm. And we don't know that until we get there.
So what was more experimental 5-7 years ago could have even found its moment now to actually become more, I don't know, irrelevant of a form for collaboration and working together?
That's a good question. Jim, you've worked with me the longest from this group. What would you say to that? Do you think that it is a viable model?
I think it's absolutely a viable model. I think more. I think it should happen more often. That people with greatly different backgrounds and approaches, who are passionate about the same kinds of problems, coming together. I think it's the way that we have a better chance of coming up, I think, with really productive solutions. And I'll say, from a very selfish point of view, it's one of my, one of the ways in which I maintain sanity. I'm a climatologist. It's depressing. It's depressing as hell. But the kind of conversations that I have with Jean and Aviva clear the air a little bit. It's like sort of a little bit of mental flossing. It brings very different ways of viewing the problem together, or viewing these problems together. And I find that to be very intellectually challenging. And I like that. I mean, I think most of us as academics would like that, and do like that. I highly recommend it.
Well, I have been thrilled to have Baird and Catherine join us today. Would either one of you, as our honored guests, like to make some comments before Jim absconds?
Well,
See, I've been abused for years, by the way.
speaking
Go
of
ahead, Baird.
Speaking of Memphis, we're having a thunderstorm right now, so it's actually quite exciting. I'm looking out. I live right over the Mississippi River, and so I can see the storm sort of coming up the channel, and it's pretty amazing. But that's just a little personal observation.
I would say something really quick here, that those of us who are teachers as well, we have other younger generations that we are responsible to. And to extent, when we talk about pessimism, and that as we get older, that, as we see more and feel that the temporality of the problems, etc., are overwhelming, that we still have to teach. So we're still teaching people who haven't started their life, as agents in the world yet. And so are we creating with our own work, either as teachers, activists, whatever, are we creating platforms for these younger people so they can do the work that needs to be done? And that, I feel it means, more invention and, than what our universities and our other institutions give us to work with. They need new platforms. And I feel urgently it's my responsibility as a teacher to help them get platforms that they can be positive within and feel that they can make a change and that they can make a difference, even if their energy exceeds mine right now.
Jean, you're always the voice of wisdom. I know you're escaping, Jim. It's always at least a minute early with you. Jim, would
Very nice to meet all of you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Jean,
Yeah,
would
Jim.
you like to close us off with any words of wisdom or insight?
I have none, but I was at,
Virginia.
I wanted to add in just a tiny bright spot
Please.
with Baird down there looking. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Great. Baird was talking about being down there looking at the river, and I think we had a slight 9/11 experience with the Protect Our Aquifer issue here.
Yeah.
Where people became aware of TVA drilling wells that were going to pollute our drinking water. And it got a lot of people involved. And I think governmental institutions changed. And I think it's a bright spot. What do you think about it, Baird?
I do too. Yeah. Very much so. Yeah.
So you might enjoy looking into that, the rest of you. It's been quite astonishing, really.
Well, just to very quickly introduce Virginia. Virginia comes from one of the oldest families in Memphis and has been an activist, I think, most of your life, and is very knowledgeable about the area where Jim and Jean and I worked on Fish Story Memphis. So I've been very grateful to sustain a connection with Virginia and to continue to be informed by her. And she gave me the heads up to question that plan.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's always such a treat for me to have all these conversations ratcheted up to the level of science and philosophy. When you're down in the trenches arguing about silly little details, you sort of feel very separated from the thoughts. So it's a nice, thank you for inviting me to join today.
I'm so delighted that you could join us. So sometimes we trail off for a few minutes past the hour. Jean or Baird or anybody else, would you like to add anything to close?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you, please.
Well, I wish Jim was here, but I was at a science meeting and we had a kind of a lunch meeting, informal, and we were paired with people dealing with the stress of climate change coming. And I was paired with a graduate student from Canada, and we asked a question, talked about it, and then reported back to the group, you know, which was in a few minutes, just called it a dyad. And it was very non-judgmental and listening, you might say. She started to cry. It was so built up. She was a climate student looking at climate issues from Canada, and it was just finally burst out. And part of this, I'm going to then tie into a sense of grief that is in the background that we push away. It's like a funeral. And you have lost the place for, you might say, Joan Halifax, Roshi. Joan Halifax said, you know, there's no place for love to land. You have grief. And so I signed up for a
Oops, you just broke up.
Oh, Jean, I think you need to mute your computer speakers because you have two speakers going on right now. That's what causes the echo.
Gotcha. How's that?
Better.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
How's that?
It's perfect. You were on
Okay.
the grief of the funeral.
So there's a sense of grief that about losing something. And on the other hand, the minister here said, scratch a cynic, find an idealist. Because it's paired. We push away the pain because at the same time, we don't realize what we also appreciate or could appreciate because we've lost it. And so I'm saying that there's a kind of a gratitude and a grief, a pain and an appreciation that are side by side with each other. And we can't push one out without losing aspects of the other. So we have to nurture the gratitude and also to accept the pain, because we understand that there's something better there if we have the pain. And that's where you have gratitude, because it is better there. And we can't segment ourselves that way. We're human beings. So we have to learn how to deal with that through this whole process. As I guess my last, I'm not sure that's the right way to close, but
That's very reliably wise from you, Jean.
I think it was perfect.
Yes, Baird, did you want to say something further?
Just very briefly addressing optimism, pessimism, and that sort of thing. You hailed me back to the ancient Greeks, Plato, and so on. I'd like to move a little bit further forward in the history of philosophy to the 17th century, and in particular, Rene Descartes, who had this almost a vision of a wonderful new science that he thought would enable human beings to master nature and bend it to our uses. And at the moment he was envisioning this, Galileo Galilei was under house arrest. Bruno had been burned at the stake a century earlier. The entire religious and political establishment was still fully in the Middle Ages, and it must have looked pretty pessimistic at that point that this marvelous vision that he had could be realized. But it was, and we're living in that world, and we are now seeing its errors, how it's put us in the position that we are. And so we're now trying to envision a much more organic and integrated and harmonious and just sort of world. And we can look around us and see that the political situation and the social situation seems hopeless for us to achieve it. But Descartes managed for his vision to come true. It took a while. And so I think that we should just think that we might succeed as well to bring about the changes and the vision of the future that we would like to entertain.
That is also very wise and very hopeful, and I am very grateful. And thank you all for joining us today. It's been quite wonderful.
Thank you. Thank
Nice
you
to
for
meet you
inviting me. I
all.
appreciate it.